All right, we're live. We're rolling
We're
here.
live.
Yeah.
Awesome. Awesome. Well, how's it going, everybody? I wonder how many of the guys logged on right now are the same ones that we just had for classroom.
Yeah, we can't tell. It doesn't tell us who's watching. It tells us how many people are watching.
I
Um,
wonder how many of the guys yeah. So today what we're going to do is we're going to have a little discussion.
Yeah, we
Nothing
can't
too
tell.
formal. We're just going to be talking about the differences between conducting goalie sessions or practices with teams, and try to figure out, I don't know, what's more efficient for development when it comes down to the off season. Um, so Ben, you said you actually wrote down some stuff, eh? You actually got prepared for this.
Yeah. I mean, it's just like I spent about a half hour, 45 minutes this afternoon thinking. The main thing you want to think about, or to think about when we're talking about what's going to be more efficient for training, is we have to look at the differences between the different environments. What those differences are and how those are going to impact your ability to develop, your ability to make saves, and your ability to implement skills into game situations. Because really, when we talk about training and skill development, skill acquisition, skill retention, skill application, we'll discuss more about what those things are. But the overall outcome, the overall goal is what's going to benefit you the most in games. What's going to allow you to stop more pucks when it matters. So that's going to be kind of what we go over today, and neither of us really have a firm answer. We just kind of want to chat and see where it goes. So it's going to be pretty informal. And if you guys have any questions or any thoughts, please put them in the chat as we go, and
Totally.
we'll
So
get rolling.
I guess the one thing I always wonder is now would it matter based on the age and the skill level? Personally, I think that if you're younger, the thing about goalie ice time sometimes is it can be very dry. I guess you could say some kids might find it boring to talk about certain details, but then it might come down to the coaching style as well.
Yeah, I
Um,
think we do a decent job of trying to make dry material entertaining. I could I
oh,
could
we
be I
try.
could be wrong about that, but I think we at least try. That's for sure.
Yeah, we do. We do. That's what one thing is that find a balance a lot of times between being able to get the work done and actually being able to get kids to learn the skills and to having them have fun, because that's one thing that when we come down to the advantages disadvantages of practices versus goalie ice times, I think team practices in general can potentially be more fun for the kids just because they're surrounded by their peers. Versus a goalie ice time, you're a lot of times often you're one on one with your goalie coach, and it's not, you're most of the time, not always, but most of the time, when you have a goalie coach, one on one time with a goalie coach, nowadays your goalie coach is a paid coach, so you're not going to be trying to waste time having fun or whatever it is. You're trying to have fun while learning, but you're actually going there to work while when you at practice, you're in a sense trying to have fun, right? So what do you think of that?
I guess we kind of have to set our terms. We have to talk about what the
Yeah.
outcome is. Like if our goal is to essentially talk about which is better for development. So when you mention having fun and having an enjoyable experience, does the fact that an experience is enjoyable translate into the ability to implement skills? Does it make you better in a game situation?
Hmm.
So,
Hmm.
not saying that it's not valuable. There's obviously a lot of value to being surrounded by your peers and having a fun experience. It's going to really improve your enjoyment of the game and probably how long you play the game.
Yeah.
But I don't know if that's the question we're trying to answer
Yeah.
right now.
Yeah. Yeah.
So
Well,
a different question altogether, or it could be related. We could potentially come to the conclusion that you may, by having fun, regardless of the type of situation, by improving enjoyment, then we're going to improve retention of skills because we're improving your ability to pay attention because you're enthusiastic about it.
well, there's one thing that an interesting talk that I listened to. It was it's the head coach for the University of Massachusetts. He's one of the heads of Hockey USA. And he was saying one thing they've been trying to figure out is how to be able to balance working on skills while also having fun. Because one thing they found is with players in general, we're not talking about goalies now. We're talking about players. Um, a lot of times the way practices are set up is they would start off with some skating drills initially, and they what they realize is kids may get better at skating, but they find it boring. So because finding it boring, they don't find it as engaging. Because they don't find it as engaging, they don't obviously improve as quickly, and they also get very static in their ability. So they're able to, you know, learn the skills, but they can't really do it in games as well, because on games you have to make reads, right? So one thing that he started playing around with is being able to make games that will work on those specific skills. So for skating, for example, if you have a little kid, you're trying to work on their edges, their inside and outside edges, he would set up four dividers and make a little box, basically put one player in, and the game was the players on the outside had to step into the box and step out without getting tagged. The kid in the middle was trying to tag them, and what ends up happening is the kids have a lot of fun because they're playing tag, but are also working on their edges because they're jumping into the box and out of the box. They have to get on one edge and pull out, kind of deal. They have to keep their head up because they have to understand what's happening around them. And he found that the development of the skill was ramping up much faster just because kids were having fun while working on the skill, basically. So one thing I do wonder is when it comes down to practices, for goalies specifically, is one of the issues sometimes that drills are in practice, whether it's a goalie ice time or a regular team practice, can drills get too static, and do goalies end up just playing the drill just due to being bored, quote unquote?
Yeah, I think there's a potential for that. I also think there's a potential. This will be kind of what I get into a bit more. I also think, as you say, play the drill. I think there's a potential for not necessarily boredom, but for kids to learn adaptations or skills that are effective for a drill, but not effective for a game. And that's one. That is one, I guess, stark difference when you talk about the games for players versus games for goalies. Is a lot of times the games that players are playing are not as effective for goaltenders to maintain their skills. You know, like you and I have had discussion about small area games before, and talked about like our small area games. We know we do them in evaluations sometimes. Our small area games, an effective tool for evaluating goaltenders, and potentially are they an effective tool for goalies to get better, for goalies to learn and implement skills. And I think the answer we always come to is it could be, but it's not guaranteed.
Yep.
And I think it can be the same thing with drills and practices. Are drills and practice, are they effective for enhancing goaltenders' abilities in game situations, or are they effective for enhancing goaltenders' abilities for that specific situation or that specific drill? So that's going to be what we get into a little bit more. I see a chat. I'm going to have to turn my head here to read it because I got two screens going. Oh, it's Jung-Soo.
Yeah. So Jung-Soo says, well, but we can do team practice during a season a lot. So my opinion is goalie sessions is better than team practices during off season. Well, that's one thing that I actually agree with is when it comes down to off season training. One argument I hear a lot is that in the off season, some goalies prefer doing player ice times because the practices are more dynamic. You could say players are obviously, or at least in some cases, not in my case because I'm pretty skilled, but most of the time, players are more skilled than the goalie coaches. But again, not in my. But so what ends up happening is a lot of goalies end up going to those practices because they want the faster pace of play, right? But the question I always ask myself is, being with better players, will that make you better than doing, let's say, more quote unquote static drills with a goalie coach? And I think there's a balance there. And if we're talking if we're trying to talk within the framework of the off season, so after the season's over, I think that working with your goalie coach is better than working with players. And my reasoning behind it is, number one, you just finished the season, you practice with players the whole time, right? So you just had a whole season of good shots, I guess you could say, dynamic plays, all those things. And when it comes down to skill building, when it comes down to skill acquisition, the best way to learn skills is by slowing it down. So how are you going to be able to practice a skill if things are always going at 100% speed all the time? And even taking out of the framework of hockey, I've done martial arts for a long time. I've done jiu-jitsu for a long time, and I I couldn't imagine learning, and you've done it as well. Like I couldn't imagine like learning jiu-jitsu going 100 miles an hour all the time, right? And like trying to wrap techniques super fast. You have to be able to feel it, right?
It's
And the
like
only
your
way,
first jujitsu class ever, where you just
yep,
get your ass kicked nonstop.
yep, yeah, you're just drowning.
It's at a high speed, and you know zero skills, because it's
Exactly.
not natural body mechanics. Yeah, like you
So you
said,
go
yeah,
back
you
to
just drown. Yeah.
you go back to what feels comfortable, right? The thing is, I think it's the case for goalies as well. Is let's say we work with some goalies and we try to talk to them about narrowing their base a little bit in their stance. Well, it's that adjustment is going to be a lot easier to make when you're one on one your goalie coach going through movements and going through a slower paced practice than if you get on the ice with a bunch of players because without really wanting to. I think that we're just the reason why a lot of us play sports because we're competitive. And if you're a competitive person, you get into practice, you're not going to let yourself get scored on just because you're working on a
Mm.
skill. You just don't want to get scored on, right? Like if you're any goalie with who's somewhat competitive, you're not going to want to get scored on practice. It's just not going to happen, right? So if you don't want to get scored on practice, well, you're going to go back to what feels comfortable and what works best for you. So you might not work on a skill needed. You're just going to work on not getting scored in practice, and that's where I find a lot of bad habits are being built by some goalies as they start focusing um, on adapting to the drill instead of trying to work on their skills. Basically, they'll play the drill instead of actually work on their skills.
Yeah, that's actually one thing. Like when I was doing my thinking this afternoon, I really started to come back to is you mentioned the term adapting. Is we base our framework, and you can tell our name's Evolution Goaltending Consultants. We base our framework generally on the theory of evolution about adapting to survive, but we usually use the term adapting to thrive because we don't want to just survive; we want to dominate. But our the framework that we always look at things through is through an evolutionary framework, and when you start to look at player sessions versus goalie sessions, there's really three different or three areas of difference that I kind of thought about. Is the first is the difficulty of shots. So as Nick mentioned, we generally assume that the players you're going to see in your skill sessions are going to be better than we are. Depending on your age, sometimes, and honestly for me, depending on the day. Some days I'm real good. Some days I can't raise the puck. I'm sure everyone listening, if you've done a list with me, you're aware of that. Generally, we assume that the difficulty of shots is going to be way higher, just because skilled players they have the velocity that they release shots at is faster. They have a quicker release. They have better puck movement. So, for example, pushing, pulling, skating laterally to change angles, and they're also more deceptive. They're able to try to get you guys to think that they're shooting one way and then doing something the opposite. So the difficulty of shots that you're going to face is going to be way higher. The second thing is the volume and the pace of shots that you're going to face. So, for example, I'm sure, again, anyone that's done a lesson with us before, we spend probably half the time talking because we're focused strictly on theory, strictly on skill acquisition and skill implementation. So that requires a lot of discussion, a lot of feedback, and a lot of correction. So when we're doing sessions, there's a good portion of time that you're not actually seeing shots. If you do a player session, player ice time, there's a chance that you see double to three times as many shots in the same amount of time. So in that sense, you're potentially able to you potentially have more opportunity to implement a certain skill because you're just seeing opportunities more. So that would be the second difference between a goalie session and a player session. And the third one, as we talked about already, is I call it the complexity of the situation. So that's how dynamic an environment is. In a goalie session, generally there's just one shooter. Sometimes we might do a tandem. There might be two of us, but it's usually just one of us. And a lot of the times we even tell you where we're shooting and the reason why, so that, again, you can slow things down and really start to apply skills. Whereas as soon as you get to a player practice, a player ice time, that's not there. Players are shooting to score, so they're going to shoot wherever. Again, they're extremely skilled when it comes to shot release and puck movement. So just even the shot release is way more complex. But now you're adding 2-on-1s, you're adding game-like situations, you're starting to add a lot of complexity to the environment compared to the goalie session. So the reason why I bring up those three things in a goalie session compared to a practice session is all of those things apply what the theory of evolution calls selective pressures. The more harsh an environment, the more difficult an environment, the more opportunity there is for an organism to mutate and adapt. Now, again, through an evolutionary framework, those mutations are genetic. When you look at a goaltending framework, those mutations are going to be the skills that you apply or the skills that you learn. So the reason why I bring that up is when we're thinking about adaptation, when we're comparing a goalie session to a practice environment, the one question we have to ask ourselves is, are the adaptations that we learn, or sometimes it could be just you figuring it out yourself. If you're in, say, a 2-on-1 situation, there's a 2-on-1 drill and you're going to see 20 reps in a row. If the first few reps, maybe you're not having a lot of success, you're getting scored on, and then you start to change the way you play, you start to adapt, and you start to have a little bit more success. So that's an adaptation that's going to cause you to have a bit more success. But is that adaptation in that practice environment going to be an adaptation that's going to allow you to thrive in a game environment? Now, that assumes that what you're seeing in a practice environment is almost identical to what you're going to see in a game environment. And that's really for me, that's the biggest question we have to ask ourselves when we're looking at the quality of training and the quality of the adaptations that you're going to gain. And that's really a more theoretical way of what Nick said initially of, do goaltenders just adapt to the drill and not to a game-like environment? I don't know. What are your thoughts on that?
Well, I think it also comes down to the individual goalie as well. We've been to a lot of practices where the goalies are just playing the drill, right? They're adapting to the drill itself and trying to make it as easy as possible to make saves during the drill itself. So, for example, you're just warming up, and it's a flow drill, and the players have to shoot. They have to shoot as soon as they enter the zone. They get top of the circle. They shoot on net. You'll see some goalies are just going to get out 2 feet out of their crease, which you'll probably never do when the puck's in your zone, established in your zone. They'll get out 2 feet out of their crease, and then the shot's going to get a release. They'll just stay up. The puck's going to hit their pads and just bounce right back out through the middle. They made the save, but they're just playing the drill at that point, right? And part of me thinks that is either the individual themselves just not thinking it through, or potentially just cheating, I guess you could say, because we've seen goalies do that before, but I've obviously seen goalies who on every single shot try to be as detailed as they possibly can. They try to relay it from what would it look like in a game and how should I handle it in this practice. So do you think that a lot of the issues when it comes down to team practices not being let's say as efficient for goalies in general, does that come down to the individual only, or is it something where coaches should be aware of and try to mitigate such a situation?
Yeah, I think that's part of it. You and I have worked with teams, so we've talked to a lot of coaches about how to make practice as goalie friendly as possible. And when we say goalie friendly, the goalie's not going to be the priority, but how can you structure drills so that they're the most relevant to a game situation? And that's something that has a real impact on the quality of a goalie's ability to adapt from a practice to a game environment. Again, if they're able to see practice situations that are direct mirrors to game situations, it's going to be more effective for the adaptations they make in practice to translate to a game. But then the question that I kind of ask myself when you mention the difference between a goalie who just gets good at playing a drill and that adaptation is not effective versus a goalie who focuses specifically on the details each time, each repetition they see, they're extremely detail focused, is how did they get to be that way? Mm-hmm. Because right now we're talking about we're really essentially kind of comparing goalie sessions to regular practice. The question there becomes, can a goaltender be that detailed in every single repetition in a practice environment? if they're not as knowledgeable or if they haven't learned the skills in a static goalie environment to start with.
That's exactly it, right? Because then if they don't learn the skill and they just focus on practice only, all it ends up happening is, like you said, they just adapt to the situation, but you're not potentially. And to be fair, there is an advantage to goalies who can actually think outside the box, and I think it's a skill on its own, being able to adapt to whatever situation arises. There, but at the same time, you may adapt in a way that is not most efficient, I guess you could say. Um, well, if you learn the goalie, if you do more goalie specific training, you'll learn how to be more efficient. But you may not learn as well how to adapt as well. Just because when you go to a goalie ice time, and it's different on the age group, right? Like a lot of times with the older goalies, we can have discussion about how to handle certain plays and what they prefer. But with the younger goalies, it turns into more of a this is the way of doing it. This is the way you should be doing it, and would that just make it where they may get more efficient, but they lose the ability to think outside the box and making reads, just because they're trying to always handle a play the quote unquote proper way, let's say.
Um, I think when it comes down to like when you're right now, you're kind of discussing differences in skill level, and we brought that up initially. Is like, does it depend on a goaltender's skill level, which is going to be more effective for their long term development? And when you're talking about younger guys, and when you say like the quote, "This is the way that you should handle that situation," the main discussions that we have with young goaltenders about quote the way is not actually about making reads. It's more so about the skills that they're implementing. I find like very rarely when we have if we're say talking about rush management, we're talking about post play. There's a big difference between techniques and tactics.
Yeah.
And when we're talking about making reads, and this is how we start to learn to handle situations, that's us discussing tactics. And to me, like there's definitely a hierarchy of importance, and the techniques are at the, I guess they'd be at the base of the hierarchy because they're the foundation. So if we don't have the techniques, that foundation, it's very difficult for us to discuss making reads. You know, for example, a read that you would make on a 2-on-1 is to manage your depth backwards. As you manage your depth backwards, so that you can keep the weak side player in front of you, you can stay on angle, you have a chance to make a save on both a shot release and a pass. But if your ability to move to stay on angle, if your ability to shuffle isn't very good, if your ability to butterfly slide isn't quite as good, and your ability to move forward and back isn't that good, how you handle that play isn't very relevant. You know, I can handle that play perfectly, but if when a shot's released, if my stance isn't good and I can't make a save, it doesn't the actual read that I make doesn't really have an impact on whether I make that save or not.
Now, should there be a base skill level? So we all know goalies who are um, not the most technical or most efficient, I guess you could say, but they just stop puck, right? They're really good at stopping pucks, which is obviously a good thing. Is do you get to a certain point where if you have a base level of skill, you're almost better off switching to doing a majority more team practice, player practices to actually get more reads going, or are you better off just working more on your technique?
I think it's a blend between the two, and I see Mark in the chat kind of says the same thing, and that's sort of the feedback that we've been getting. Is having a blend between the two is generally going to be going to be ideal. Um, you know, we talked about this before. It depends on which phase of the off season you're in.
Yeah.
When we're talking about
Yeah.
off season development, there is an opportunity for practice situations and player situations to be more effective than goalie situations. But is that always true, and is that always the case? Even if you're at your base skill level, as you mentioned, like
Yeah.
if you know once you can do all your techniques, once you can do all your shot preparation techniques, all your post play techniques are good. From there, there's definitely going to be a benefit. But just because you have that base skill level doesn't mean that you never revisit your skills again. Doesn't mean that
Absolutely.
you only make reads. You only start to do player situations to basically learn the game better. I think the answer is obviously no, and I think everybody would see that the base skill level needs to be continually maintained rather than just achieved once and then never looked
And
back
that's
at
it.
it again.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. Now the just to move the discussion somewhere else, if let's say we're in the off season right now, what is the perfect way, the perfect system to train goalies? What would you say?
Well, we talked about this before. Is I always see a phase system, a system of basically skill development. There's skill acquisition first, and then skill application from there, and then that's essentially the off-season development model that we look through. The off-season, sometimes we have anywhere between 4 and 6 months, depending on the age and how long guys are training, how long their season goes. Sometimes we have a little bit longer, maybe 6 or 7 months. So when we break it into phases, we always want to look at skill acquisition first, and sometimes we even look at that regardless of age and regardless of skill level. There's times, and we started the discussion with this, about how practice isn't always a direct simulation of a game situation. And in those situations, goalies may have adaptations in both their skills and their tactics that aren't effective for a game situation. Even if you think about a year like this year where goalies didn't play games really at all they saw was practice. And if those practices weren't always game-like, there's a situation that they could have maladaptive tendencies, or, for lack of a better term, bad habits that come out of there. So the whole idea of the skill acquisition phase, it's not always acquiring skills that you didn't have before. It's also potentially skill refinement.
Retainment.
Yeah. Oh, not necessarily retainment. Retainment means memory over time, and that's actually our goal going into the season. So when I say skill refinement, I mean,
Sorry, I got those terms from the book that I never gave back to you.
Oh yeah, totally. Totally. I'm pretty sure it was given to me anyway, so no big deal. Yeah.
There's actually a few guys, like for example, Dylan Beebe said that in his comment on Instagram. He said, team practices, especially system practice, can be more beneficial for game-like scenarios with more realistic threats.
Mm-hmm.
Other than that, I'm taking goalie session every time for personal skill development.
Yeah, totally.
And that's, when I look at it, it seems to be the case for most goalies. And I think that's where we stand to as coaches, right? It's one of those things where in practices, as long as you can see game realistic scenarios, it can definitely be beneficial. But I think the problem that we end up seeing very often is it's not, right? But at the same time, I don't blame coaches, because sometimes coaches have to design drills for the players, right? There's a lot of them that they have to they have to make better, and they don't know much about goaltending, so they have to do what they can to make the players better, right? Now, that being said, I still think there is a responsibility on the part of the goaltenders in doing everything they can to be as detailed as possible in practice and not just trying to cut corners. And I think that's actually something that we can talk about next week with Daniel Hauser, because that's one thing that I noticed with him, that is when he was at a young age, it didn't matter what the practice was like. He would, every single save that he makes in practice, he makes it like he would in a game. He's not ever trying to just play the drill. He tries to handle every single play like he would in a game, no matter what the drill's like. And I think that's on the flip side, although practices may not be as beneficial when it comes down to trying to build skills, it's on the onus on the individual goaltender to actually try to put in the work and doing the best they can. But like you said earlier, that can only happen if they have the knowledge, if they know what they're supposed to be doing, I guess, right?
Yeah, it's sort of, you always take what you can out of every drill in practice. Like there's going to be times where it's going to be a 2-on-0 drill, and everybody knows the shooters are instructed to try to handle it like a game situation. Like make one lateral pass and then it's a one-timer or a quick shot, or shoot for a secondary opportunity. Things that would be realistic, but we all know how well players listen to those instructions, and if they start doing it, maybe it usually fades after the first couple repetitions. So having that knowledge and knowing that practice is not always going to be perfect for you guys to work on things, it does come on you to just take what you can out of the drills. When you say like take what you can, think about the skills that you're working on. If you're seeing a 2-on-0 situation that's going to have multiple passes, your goal could be to stay north-south, to maintain body position on every pass as long as you can until you have to compete. And then, although, maybe your save percentage is fairly low just because it's not a strict game-like situation, you're developing adaptations that are going to benefit you in the long run, while still being able to compete and while still making reads. If you're 100% skill focused, there might be a chance that in practice your performance might drop a little bit, because if it's not a strict game like situation, or every situation is an extremely high quality scoring area. If you think about a flow drill, a lot of times players will just skate into the hash marks and rip a shot high, and in a game situation that only happens really in a breakaway. It's very rare or I don't want to say very rare, it depends on how good your team is, but it should be quite a rare scenario. Yeah. But instead of strictly focusing on one side or the other, instead of focusing on being extremely outcome focused, in which case you may develop maladaptations, or being extremely skill focused, in which case your skills might get better, but it might be really difficult to make saves. Finding a balance between what I can work on in this scenario before I have to essentially resort to desperation, compete, and make saves. I think that's really the balance that should be struck when it comes to regular practice and player sessions.
So I think we obviously agree that goalie sessions specifically are best designed for skill acquisition. Now the question is when is it proper? Let's say in a perfect world, you're doing goalie ice times during the off season because you're trying to refine your skills or at least learn new skills. At what point is it okay for you to start switching over to team practices or player practices?
Yeah, I think to me it's once your save process skills are back refined. When we talk about the baseline skill set, once you get a good skill refinement from the end of the season, I think for me it would be about 2 months after the beginning of off-season training. Not 2 months from the end of the season, but if you could do 4 weeks, and it doesn't have to be sessions every day, if you do goalie sessions for 1 session a week for 2 months, I think, to me, again, every goalie is different. Some goalies might be able to jump in much quicker. Maybe they're somebody who's able to be more skill focused in practice, so their skill, they don't need as much refinement, or they don't need as much acquisition. But I think once you hit a baseline set of skills that you can move into more player practice and game-like scenarios. The way it's been explained to me, or the way I like to explain it, is moving through the 3 phases of learning. So again, I think it's in that book that you have right there. The three phases of learning skills are the cognitive phase, the associative phase, and the automatic phase. And our goal with implementing any skills or with learning skills is to always get our skill set into the automatic phase. And what that means is our skills, we've done enough repetitions that we've developed long-term potentiation. Our neurons are firing automatically based on a stimulus. Now, as we move towards there, we generally start in what's called the cognitive phase of learning. The cognitive phase of learning is really slow, and there's a lot of errors. So, for example, if the goalies are listening, I'm sure you can remember when you first learned how to move. Every time you learn a new skill, you go through the cognitive phase at the start. When we first learn how to move, our self-talk is going to be very slow. We're going to have to use a lot of imagery. But you think about moving, the 5 steps to any type of movement is look, rotate, load, gather, extend. Now, if you're young, I'm sure you remember learning that. Some of you guys might not even remember when you learned that, but that's a perfect example of the cognitive phase. We'll say go, and every time you have to move, you're going to look, you're going to physically rotate, you're going to load, you're going to gather and extend. And once you start to develop the order of operations, you start to get those skills a little bit more refined, a little bit more in tune. That's when you start to hit the associative phase. So the associative phase is when you can start to chunk information together. So rather than, say, going through the 5 steps of moving, instead of going through look, rotate, load, gather, extend, you can start to chunk look, rotate, and load together. Or you can even start to chunk look, rotate, load, gather together, and then from there you can focus on the extension and trying to generate a lot more power. And when you start to do that, instead of having 5 different pieces of information that you have to look through, you only have 2 different pieces of information to look through, because you have those 2 different chunks that you're using and you're associating them together. And then from enough repetitions, again, that requires some imagery, it requires some self-talk. You can start to, your self-talk can start to combine things. So instead of look, rotate, load, you can think of staying north-south. It's really the same type of concept, but it's combined in one phrase rather than 3 different ones. Once you get enough repetitions from there, it should eventually become automatic to the point that you no longer have to cognitively process, or you no longer have to consciously think about it anymore. And that frees up your cognitive space, the amount of things that you can hold in your attention at once. It frees up a lot of that space so that now you can start to focus on the tactics. So the reason why I bring up the 3 phases of learning is when goalies are in practice environments and they start to have adaptations, most of the time they're acting in the automatic phase, which is where they should be acting, because if you're in either the cognitive or the associative phase, when you're in a dynamic environment, the plays happen way too fast for you to think about it. We have to subconsciously act. We have to act automatically in those situations. Otherwise, we're going to be too far behind the play to actually make saves. But when you're in a practice environment, not always consciously or associatively attuned to your body mechanics and attuned to your skills, what happens is you start to have adaptations that are going to make you succeed in that practice environment, but might not always be exactly a game-like replica situation. And that's where we start to develop what you would term a bad practice habit, or a practice habit in general. And when we start to see goalies in the off season come back from practice, there's a few things that generally happen with most goalies. Their feet will be a little bit wider, they'll start to be a little bit more relaxed, their elbows will start to get a little bit tighter. So those are automatic adaptations that they've developed in their practice or game environments. So our goal with the skill acquisition phase, so that would be the first couple months, again, maybe the first eight ice times coming back from the off season, is to move from the automatic phase and generally move back into the associative phase. Now, very rarely with experienced goaltenders will you move back to the cognitive phase. Someone who's used a butterfly slide on a high to low lateral feed, for example, maybe there's a goaltender who's not getting north-south, not rotating enough. You're not going to go back to look, rotate, load, gather, extend. There's no point. It's just going to be too slow. You're going to go back to the big chunks of information. So the goal is to move from the automatic phase back to the associative phase to make the refinements and make the corrections to the practice habits that have been automatically developed, and transition those habits back into the automatic phase, but in a more efficient manner. I talked for a while there. Does that make sense?
Yeah. It makes a lot of sense. Yeah. The question I would ask you now is, like, when you talk about goalies adapting in quote unquote wrong way, or adapting to drill specifically, and it wouldn't potentially work in a game. What are examples that you've from experience that you've seen goalies do in practice? I think it'd be good for some goalies to kind of hear what it is that you've seen them do in a practice environment that they may not be aware of, that is actually detrimental for their gameplay.
The first one that I kind of think about always is depth management. We talk about we've already mentioned the base width and elbows that happens, but I think those are also, the base width and the elbows are also more symptoms rather than causes of depth. And I think what happens a lot of times, especially, we mentioned flow drills a lot. That's how most teams are going to start their practice. They're going to start their practice with drills that are going to get the players moving, give the goalies a lot of shots. And even if players are instructed to, take shots in realistic situations, the same way that you mentioned at the start, the goalies are extremely competitive. They're not going to accept not making saves. Players are the same way. They're not going to accept not scoring goals. So, if you think about a flow drill as sort of a rush, it should be a simulated rush, should be a simulated one-on-one. But if players always handle it realistically, their chances of scoring a goal are really low. The chances of shooting from the top of the circle, coming down the wing and scoring a goal are pretty rare. So what they do is they develop adaptations that are going to make them successful in practice the same way the goalies do. So they, instead of coming down the wing, they start coming a bit more down the middle. Instead of shooting from the top of the circle, they take a couple extra strides and start to shoot from the top hash mark. So in those situations, they're again a breakaway is a realistic situation, but the percentage of shots that you see on a breakaway should be exponentially less than
Minimal.
the percentage of shots that you see from the top of circle or from less high quality areas. But in those situations now, when players are adapting to score goals, every situation is turning into a breakaway, and that's a difficult play for a goalie to make a save on. Especially, it's more difficult than if a player just has a puck in between the hash marks, stationary. Say if they receive a pass on a pass out and they have to shoot, they're standing still. So just by virtue of skating towards the net, that shot has way more velocity than it does. So it's one of the most difficult saves to make. And now goalies are seeing that over and over and over and over again in flow drills. In my experience, in practices, and the way that goaltenders adapt to that situation is to challenge more, because you can try to be more patient, you can try to be more active with your hands, but at the end of the day, you're looking at a scoring situation that if you give Alexander Ovechkin or Steven Stamkos that shot, out of 10 shots, they're going to score 9 and hit the post on 1.
Yeah.
So the only way a goalie can really adapt to have success in that situation is to gain more depth. And in gaining more depth, that leads to less time to react, which is already pretty minimal because they're shooting from fairly close in. But now, rather than focusing on the skills that you want to implement in most situations. So, for example, being reactive, being patient, activating your hands, keeping your base underneath your body, you're applying a skill that, although is not effective, you're applying it in, say, like 80% of situations. You're developing an adaptation that in a game you're going to use in maybe 5% of situations. So there's just to me, there's a big disconnect there, and that's one of the biggest habits that I see goalies developing is just having excess depth that they probably don't even necessarily want in most game situations, and that's having the detrimental effect of the stance details we talked about, the base width, the elbows off body, the patience on feet. I don't know. What about you? What do you see?
Or like you
Yeah.
said earlier that you notice a lot of goalies get their elbows very tight to their body, and I think part of it is due to what you just said when it comes down to depth, because the further out you get out of your crease, and the more depth that you apply, technically speaking, you don't need to react as much to the puck because you're getting tighter proximity to the puck. The closer proximity you are to the puck, the less time you have to react, but the more space you fill. Usually what ends up happening is you make your initial save easier to make. However, your control over the puck will diminish because you don't have as much time to react. Versus if you're a little bit deeper in your crease, the puck has traveled a longer distance to get to you. So if it takes a longer distance to get to you, you technically have more time to react to it. So you may have less coverage, but you have more time to react. Therefore, you have more time to control the puck. And one thing that ends up happening, I know, as you said, is when they start to apply more depth just to play the drill and just to make saves in those high scoring situations, goalies get in the habit of keeping their body a lot tighter. And the reason why they start getting a little bit tighter is because, again, they don't need to react as much because they're filling more space. So if you get in the habit of just going down filling space, it may be good because you're, making the first initial save. But in general, a lot of goals, if not the majority of the goals, are scored off secondary opportunities in a game. So what ends up happening is as a goalie, you're getting good at making the first save, but everybody else can. I mean, I've been in any league that you play in. I don't care if you're playing, Division 6 or double A or triple A. If you're playing at the right level, you normally don't get scored on the first shot very often. It's going to happen in a game, obviously, right? Um, and if you start building a habit of just coming out a lot and keeping your body very tight, well, you're making a first save, but everybody else can do that. So it doesn't really make you special, right? And what ends up happening is you're making yourself very vulnerable for your post save recoveries, for your post save plays. So that's definitely one habit that I've noticed a lot out of guys is they come out too much, like you said, but they just end up getting their body very, very tight just because they're trying to focus more on the idea of filling space instead of focusing on the idea of actually making saves. Another thing that I've noticed quite a bit is especially off the rush. So when you think about a game in general, the game is back and forth, right? It goes in the opposite end, comes back into your end, goes back in the opposite end, comes back into your end. Obviously, that's assuming your team is decent and you're not stuck in your zone all game, right? But the rush occurs very often, but so does it in practice, right? A lot of flow drills, players are kind of skating all over the rink, and then they come back flowing towards you. And a lot of goalies will release off their goal line off the rush way too late. They're going to wait till the players are basically inside their zone. As soon as the puck here crosses their blue line, they'll start to release off their goal line. The thing is, now your rush coming out, your rush coming back, your details are not good, you're C-cutting all over the place. But in a game, you see the rush develop, and you'll usually release off your goal line earlier, which gives you more time to handle the rush, the speed of the attack. So that's one thing I did notice in practices is goalies getting tight, as well as goalies just not handling the rush as efficiently as they should, as they would in a game. And often what ends up happening is they start building a habit of releasing late and coming back with the play, and it ends up occurring in games as well.
Yeah, I was gonna say, like, do you find that the fact that rush or flow drills in particular don't allow goalies the time to handle the rush appropriately or the way they normally would in a game? Do you
That's
see?
usually what happens.
Yeah, do you see it translate in games directly?
The one thing, so first when it comes down to the to how much time they have is, I think a lot of coaches that we talk to, they understand giving the goalies more time to reset. But what ends up happening is they're a lot of times the way to conceptualize that idea is more time to get ready for the shot, right? Not necessarily more time to handle the play,
Yeah, totally.
as it is, right? So what ends up happening is, you, as a goalie, you have enough time to get ready for the shot, but you don't really have enough time to handle the play. So you don't really get to learn what is most efficient. And I did notice that does translate into games quite a bit, because, I mean, any game, most practices that we watch, goalies don't have time to get set up off the rush. They just have enough time to make the save. And then when you watch games, how often do you see goalies releasing when they should? Most of the time, goalies release late, right? Now, I'm not sure if that is because they either build that habit in practice, or if that's because they don't know how to handle
Yeah,
rush.
I guess that was my question. It's like, is that something that they've just never been told? Because even,
Mm-hmm.
if they don't have the time to do it in a practice environment, but they have the knowledge base, does that knowledge mitigate that translation of the bad habit?
I think part of it does,
Yeah.
because talking from experience now with some goalies that we coach, there's some goalies that we work with on rush quite a bit, and you see them in practice that they're not releasing off their goal line when they should, right? So obviously they've worked on it, but they're not applying it in practice. Now, is it because they're individually not really paying attention to it, or is it because they're put in a situation where they
Yeah.
can't execute it the way they want to, right? 'Cause
Yeah.
that's one thing that's hard to tell some.
Yeah, that's definitely true, and like we talk about taking what you can out of a drill, and cognitively actually thinking about how drills relate to game situations. Is it, as you mentioned, is it something that you're strictly either you're not focused on, your attention's not on that specific detail, or it's something that you're just physically not able to? And then the question is, regardless of which that is, it has a negative impact in a game. I guess not a question, but it has a negative impact in a game situation in our experience. Again, so
Yeah.
part of that is on the goaltender, part of that is on the situation.
Yeah.
So, we always talk about things that you can control, things that you can't control.
Mm-hmm.
And, you can control what you're thinking about and what you're focused and what you're working on, but you can't control the situation. So always thinking about how you're going to make situations the most effective for your gameplay is going to mitigate at least one side of those variables.
Now, when you were talking, explaining how you can go from adaptive to automatic, so when a goalie comes up to you and it says they want to do player ice times, like, what would be your recommendation? Let's say they're 2 months into the training, they've been doing goalie ice times for 2 months, so let's say eight ice times total. Technically, they're looking better. And they want to go back to skating with players, but they also want to do goalie ice times on the side. So, what would be the ratio that you would kind of tell them is most optimal? Does it depend too much on the individual, or is there, as a cookie cutter kind of way, is there a certain ratio that you would recommend?
I think it really depends on the individual. from my perspective, it depends on exactly what we just talked about. Is how well and how much attention can a goaltender apply to their specific skills and tactics in a practice environment. And again, it also depends on the practice environment. You know, when we talk about player ice times, is it a player skills ice time? You know, is it a shooting skills ice time versus is it a practice scenario? Or is it a game like scenario? You know, we think of, you can think of a forward skills, you know, something Kevin Yellowegg does and does very well versus like a D rules camp where it's mostly defensive tactics. Um, is there a difference between those two? And in my opinion, there definitely is.
Yeah.
You know, a player skills ice time where they're strictly focused on goal scoring, I don't think is even really going to give you an ability to implement your techniques the way you want to because you're not really going to see game situations. It's similar to the types of flow drills that we were talking about
Do
initially.
you think it depends on the coach a little bit? Because there's some skills coaches who focus on goal scoring who will put their players in scoring situations over and over again, but they're trying to keep it as realistic as possible because they want their players to obviously adapt to the game situational stuff. Right?
Totally, yeah. It depends on. I don't want to say the quality of the ice time, but I guess the outlook of the coach, the framework that the coach is using is gonna be relevant to how well a goaltender can adapt, or
Yeah.
or how appropriate a goalie's adaptations would be a better way to say that.
So a lot of it comes down to the quality of the ice time, basically.
Yeah, yeah.
Yeah.
And as the question you asked, I guess per ratio is depending on the goalie. You mentioned skill retention. It really depends on how well a goalie can retain skills. Generally, when you're looking at a ratio of balancing goalie sessions to player ice times, you want to ensure that you can maintain an automatic phase of skill base versus versus having to go back to the associative phase. So by maintaining an maintaining your skills in the automatic phase is important when you're in the player ice time because if you're not able to do that, then the skills that you're going to apply aren't going to be as effective. So with a ratio, if a goalie has really good skill retention, and potentially the skill retention comes from the how well they're consciously processing the information in practice, how well they're using that practice to work on their skills or to just think about the skills they've learned and apply them to that practice. So if they're fully able to retain the details, retain the skills that they've learned, the skills that they've acquired, and if they're able to have the knowledge base on their own to focus on the specific skills in the right situations, then the ratio of practice to goalie ice times can be higher. You'll be able to use those situations to apply skills much more effectively. But if you're a goalie who, when you get into that practice environment, is again we talk about the spectrum of being consciously skill focused versus being in a extremely competitive environment where your only focus is stopping pucks. If you're a goaltender who, when you're in a practice environment, always kind of finds yourself closer to the competitive end of that spectrum, that might be a guy that you're going to have to lower the ratio, maybe do a 1-to-1 ratio, so that you can make sure that their skill acquisition, they're able to retain the skills that they've acquired, rather than going back to what we call, again, those practice habits. So there's a number of different variables that go into it, and when we're deciding or if we're advising, basically it's an ongoing evaluation of seeing what goalies look like when they leave, when they start doing player skill sessions, what they look like when they come back from player skill sessions. It's always sort of an ongoing discussion.
Yeah. Yeah. No, absolutely. It's true. Like I think a majority of the guys that I've worked with, it ends up being the ratio kind of increases. As
I'm
you
just
get
gonna
closer
close the
to-
window. It's super
Yeah,
bright
sounds good.
in my office.
Sounds good. Yeah, the ratio of player ice times will increase over time. So if let's say you're looking at the off season starts in April, May, and June. Typically, the goalies will keep doing goalie ice times. In a perfect world, you'll have the goalies do goalie ice times only, and once they start hitting July, that's when I usually try to get them to increase their player ice time. So a lot of times when goalies ask like when's the right time, I'll tell them July is typically the right time. So it gives them about 2-3 months of specifically you could say static training, block training, where you just focus on your mechanics quite a bit, and it's not always technical, right? We can talk tactics as well. We can work on tactics one on one, but just
It's off. Sorry, but
no,
again,
you're good.
oh, it was good. Oh, I thought I
Yeah.
muted it. Okay. I know that's not the mute button now. The purpose of drilling, even drilling tactics 1-to-1, is to move the tactics into the automatic phase. So, for example, like when we do a lateral feed day, it's to get. It is still doing that block training. We're not necessarily adding complexity to it, but it's to make sure that your reads are automatic, so that when you add more complexity and more dynamic situations, you no longer really have to consciously process it.
Yeah.
Doing the tactics is really the same goal of doing the techniques.
Exactly. So yeah, usually the way I see it is the first couple 2 to 3 months, and again, depending on how many months of training you have in the off season, because we know a lot of pro guys who their season finishes very late. They don't start training till a little bit later into the summer. They might not get back on the ice till July. So obviously the time frame is going to be quite different there. But if you're a kid who plays minor hockey, usually the first 2 to 3 months you'll be, we'd like you to try to focus more on the static base of the game, focus more on your technique and tactics. We want your coach, build some good habits. Once you hit July, that's when you can start basically hitting those player ice times. And every goalie is different. I've seen some goalies go 2 goalie ice times to 1 practice initially. I've seen some other ones going 1-on-1. But once you hit August, especially by about the second or third week of August, once you're getting a little bit later into August, that's when I like guys start making a switch a bit more. That's when it's good for them to kind of switch right away to player ice times.
About 3 weeks out.
On that side. Yeah, exactly.
Usually, again, just thinking about the timeline, it depends on when your season starts, but generally we think about a month and a half out. So when you say mid-July, that's looking at like a midget AAA season or a junior season that's going to start at the end of August, beginning of September. That's when you're going to start doing the player ice time, so really ramping it up like 2 to 3 weeks out, so that you can. And the reason why is like by then we've discussed this with like doing late camps and things as well, or some guys starting to train like 2 weeks before the season. If you haven't really trained up until that point, there's really no point in starting them. There's not enough time for you to really acquire skills. So by acquiring your skills early and then slowly ramping up to potentially doing player ice times, you're just going to apply your skills at the pace that you need to. And that's one of the biggest differences, is the complexity and the pace. Coming back to what we started with when we talk about adapting, our goal, like the goal that we're discussing, is what's going to give you the best adaptation for game-like scenarios. So, or in real game scenarios, our job is to make saves in games. So by ramping up around that time frame, that's going to give you enough time to adapt to the increased pace compared to, even if we're doing tactics in a goalie session, it's Nick and myself skating. We're not pros.
Well, I mean, speak for yourself.
I'm not pro.
No, I'm kidding. I'm just okay. Above average, just okay. But now, so we talk a lot about off-season training. So now, if let's say you get into the season, now, obviously the nature of it is different because you're playing games, you're playing the season, you're getting ready for playoffs, you're doing a lot of things. So what should your training look like at that point? What would you recommend? How many goalie ice times with a one-on-one should a goalie do with a coach, in your opinion?
So now we're talking about the phase of skill maintenance. So again, really we look through 3 phases of training throughout the entire course of a year, whether that's off-season, preseason, and in-season. So first, when we talk about off-season, we primarily talk about skill acquisition. So that's like the learning phase, that's the cognitive and associative phase, trying to get our skills into the automatic phase. Well, losing my voice a little bit. Then from there we get to the skill application. Now that's the tactics that we talk about, and applying things in a higher pace environment, being able to apply the skills that you've acquired into those situations, into those game-like situations. So when we get to the in-season phase, now we're looking at skill maintenance. So skill, I guess it'd be kind of skill and tactic maintenance. So a lot of times doing goalie sessions, once a week, here's where we can start to taper down the goalie sessions a little bit, doing them once a week to potentially once every 2 weeks. That's going to give us a good read on which skills and which tactics need to be maintained. So for example, when we talk about I like the example of a 2-on-1. There's a lot of different aspects that go into a 2-on-1. There's a number of skills that you have to apply. You have to potentially apply shuffling, momentum builds. There's tactics that you have to apply with depth management. So now, if we're doing a session and in game situations you're having trouble on the 2-on-1 lateral feeds, that's going to be where we're going to try to maintain, and we're going to try to refine whichever of those aspects is causing the issue. Again, there's symptoms versus causes. So are you having trouble on 2-on-1s because maybe we're not getting north-south on our rotation? Maybe that's a symptom of our elbows being tight from practice habits, so we're not able to fully rotate. Or is it that we're getting beat on first shots on 2-on-1s because we're managing our depth well, and again, maybe our elbows are tight. So in that situation, being in the skill maintenance phase, we're going to look at what's actually happening, and then we're going to refine what's causing the symptoms, the causes that are relating to the issues in a game situation. So that's where you can start to taper down a little bit and really focus on what is necessary at the specific time.
So basically, instead of going through a progressive curriculum that you would do in the off season, where you try to hit every facet of the game, starting from technical all the way down to your tactics, once you get in the season, you're trying to focus more on wherever the problem lies, basically.
Yeah, and when we're having this discussion, that's not the same based on age group. Mm-hmm. That's we're thinking of both you and I were coaching in junior, so that's sort of the idea that we're thinking of, where there's not a lot of time to switch things back to the cognitive or associative phase, because we need adjustments, and we need them this week. If you get scored on three goals the same way last weekend, well, we need to address that now. So those are more the situations that we're thinking about, but that doesn't mean we can't acquire skills during the season phase. There's still plenty of opportunity to acquire skills during that phase. The only difficulty is, again, when we move from an automatic phase to an associative or a cognitive phase of training or skill acquisition or application, the speed which we can enact those skills goes down.
Yeah.
So that means that trying to change the way goalies are doing things in season may have a negative effect before it has an increased positive effect. And you and I in junior, we don't have an opportunity to have a negative effect first to have that positive effect. So we really focus on what's the issue is now. But for younger guys who are continuing to develop their skills, there's nothing saying that they're not able to take a slower approach and really focus on skill acquisition application during the season as well. But assuming the goaltenders do their work in the off season and in the preseason, then in season becomes more of a time for maintenance.
Yeah, that's the one thing is I don't think a lot of goalies realize sometimes how important the off season is. Mm-hmm. They end up doing almost the same as they would in the season, right? They go back to doing player ice times. They just practice a lot, and they keep their specific goalie training to a minimal, when really it should be the opposite at that point, right? I think you said before too, you as a goalie, you never know if the upcoming off season is the most important off season of your life.
Yeah, you can't predict it. Yeah,
you can't predict it, because there's so many guys who will think like, oh, this off season I'm gonna do these ice times, or I'm gonna keep it easy because I'm doing these other things, and next thing you know, like, you just don't make the team that you want, and that was the most important season of your life, because now it's hard to climb your way back up the hierarchy, right? So,
well, and when you think about the off season is what leads into tryouts or camps, and that's what leads into your ability to move forward in your career. So if it's an off season where you have something that's working for you really well, but then you just I decide that I'm going to try something different this off season, and this is the off season where you go into camp and you don't make it because you switch your training protocol and your training methods. That's going to delay your development, and if that was the most important off season of your career, that could delay your development indefinitely. It could delay your career. It could shorten your potentially.
That's one thing I never really understood personally as a coach is when goalies say that they want to do the player ice times mostly in the off season because they want the harder shots. They feel like, oh, you know what, last year I didn't make the team that I wanted to. The skills of the player wasn't as great as I wished, as I hoped for. So I'm going to do player ice times this time around for the off season because I want to get challenged. I want to be able to read, make better reads.
I
And then what
want
ends
to
up
play
happening,
against those players that I
yes,
should have or thought I had the chance to this year, but
yeah,
didn't. Yeah.
and my the way that I see it all the time is, well, if you just train properly in the off season, you'll make the team that you want to make, and you're going to play against the players that you want to.
Hmm.
Sure, you may go on the ice with the players right now in the off season, but then if you don't make the team that you want to make, and you end up going back to that lower level, I mean, at that point, all you're doing is you're paying to go with good shooters instead of just making a team where you could just play with top shooters because you're making a top team, right?
Hmm.
It's it's something that I think we see this very often with some goalies, especially I find it like especially when goalies hit the bantam age for some reason
Yeah.
is when that starts to happen
Well,
fairly often.
that's when elite hockey essentially begins.
Yes.
I mean,
Yeah.
there's Pee Wee HSL teams that are absolutely sick, and you would call them elite as well. But
Yeah.
Bantam is when the AAA starts. When the years now in Alberta Major Bantam and Alberta Major Midget, and that's where it really starts to feel pressure.
Yes.
I guess, yeah.
Yeah. Exactly. Any final statement you want to make before we go? My boy here is hungry and he wants to walk.
Yeah, I think Luna needs some food too. I just want to read Sean's chat real quick. It was pretty funny. It's just what we finished off. I feel that I went to a lot of edge ice times in the summer because it was always on with pro and college guys, which I think kind of low key screwed me. So
Yeah, I could see that. And again, it depends on where you're at in your training.
yeah,
Right?
it's
If you
totally individualized. That's the other thing
Yes.
too. Like we're talking about sort of a common theory, and I could call it a framework, and it's theory to practice. So we have a common framework that we're going to generally apply, but the skills, the abilities, and the motivations of the individual are going to be what determines where they sit within that framework.
So basically, if we're to give shorten what you just said, it just comes down to it's complicated.
It's
Is what it is.
complicated.
It's
Okay.
complicated. Awesome.
Basically, so yeah, so this is the first. I guess we can call it an episode. We're gonna start doing these every Thursday, since we're not on the ice, and we do enjoy hockey, so we like to talk about it. So next Thursday at the same time at 5:20, we're gonna have a special guest, and I'll let Nick talk about that real quick.
Yeah, so we're going to be, like Ben said, we'll be doing this every Thursday. If you have any subjects you'd like us to hit, we can do that. Today, we kind of, both Ben and myself actually spent some time thinking about certain points that we're going to make, but we didn't really have a set structure to the discussion.
Just wanted to chat.
So yeah, we just wanted to chat. However, there will be some we'll have try to set up a little more of a structure, which is what it'll be like next week. Already got confirmation, so we're gonna have Daniel Hauser coming on live next week. And what we want to talk to him about is the what it's like to switch from going to moving up from minor hockey to major junior. What's that transition like? Right. Daniel played mid AAA last year. Well, the last 2 seasons, he played 1 year at the Edge, midget prep, and then played a second year with the Okotoks Oilers. However, obviously, the season this year was fairly short. And then when the WHL got going again, he got called up, ended up playing 8 games. So we were really curious to see, just because it's fresh. He just got back, I think, last week or the week prior. So it's we're just really curious to see what his experience was like going from minor hockey to major junior, and we're going to ask him a few questions about that. We're actually, unlike today, where we're kind of just thinking about things and we're kind of going with the flow, we're actually going to have written questions that we're going to write up. So it's going to be a little more structured, I guess you could say.
Yeah, it's going to be interesting. We're going to be journalists. We're
Yeah,
coaches. Now we're going to try to be journalists. We're going to think of some interesting questions.
Being a journalist is easy now.
I think
all
so.
blog.
You just need a YouTube channel and a blog, and you're good.
Like go on any newspaper website, man. They're all blogs. It's all good. Well, we can do this.
Totally. All right, thanks for tuning in, guys. Yeah, I hope to see you guys again next week.